Rejected Omega Girl was to be hanged at dawn. That's what the town came to see. Rope swaying in the cold wind, church bell tolling, her boots already on the trapdoor. She had no kin to speak for her, no one to stop the law's hand. But then, the crowd parted, hoofbeats thundered up the frozen street, and the man they call the Alpha King, richest, most feared rancher in 3 counties, pointed straight at her and said, "Untie my wife." No one knew of a marriage. No one knew why he'd claim a woman the town had thrown away. But behind his words lay a promise made years before, and a secret that could break the railroad's grip on every drop of water for 100 miles. Now whispers stir in saloons and bunkhouses. Is she a fraud, or the only hope left for the land? And why would the Alpha King stake his life, his fortune, and his name on the one woman the town wanted dead? This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes across the Colorado Territory town square, each flake catching the weak winter sunlight before settling on the weathered wood of the gallows platform. Mara Loring stood straight back despite the biting cold that cut through her thin calico dress, her dark eyes revealing none of the fear that twisted in her stomach. The townsfolk huddled in clusters below, their whispers carrying up to her like wisps of bitter smoke. "Omega," they muttered, the word heavy with contempt, no better than a thief. "3 of Calder's finest horses," another voice added. "Serves her right." Mara's fingers trembled slightly, but she kept her chin high, just as her Apache mother had taught her. Being half Apache had marked her as different her whole life, but being labeled an Omega, unwanted, powerless, that was what truly set her apart in this territory. The weight of their judgment pressed down harder than the winter sky above. The sheriff cleared his throat, unfolding a piece of paper with exaggerated ceremony. His voice rang out across the square. "Mara Loring, you have been found guilty of horse theft from the Calder Ranch. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately." Her eyes moved across the crowd, searching desperately for one sympathetic face, one person who might speak up for her innocence. But she found only hard stares and turned backs. These people had decided her guilt long before any evidence was presented. The hangman approached, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. The rope felt rough and cold as he settled it around her neck, adjusting it with practiced hands. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry, the sound piercing through the hushed anticipation of the crowd. The hangman moved to the lever, his hand wrapping around it with grim purpose. The old wood creaked beneath his grip, and Mara closed her eyes, sending up a silent prayer to both her mother's gods and her father's. "Untie my wife." The voice cut through the square like a blade, deep, commanding, and as immovable as the mountains themselves. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they turned toward its source. The mass of people parted like water, revealing a massive figure wrapped in a buffalo coat. King Calder stood there, snow gathering on his broad shoulders, his eyes as cold and hard as river ice. He took one step forward, then another, his presence commanding attention with each movement. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Wife?" The sheriff's voice cracked slightly. "What nonsense is this?" King reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, holding it up for all to see. "A marriage contract, signed 3 years ago at Thompson's trading post, witnessed by Preacher Davis himself. The law says you can't hang a man's wife without his consent." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "And I do not consent." The judge, who had been watching from nearby, hurried forward to examine the document. His eyes widened as he read, and he nodded slowly. "This appears legitimate. Sheriff, remove the noose." The sheriff hesitated, his face flushed with frustration. "But the horses cannot be stolen by their rightful owner's wife." King cut him off. "Or do you mean to question my right to share my property with my own spouse?" The sheriff's jaw worked silently for a moment before he moved forward, his movement sharp with anger as he removed the rope from Mara's neck. She stood there, rubbing the rough mark it had left, trying to make sense of what was happening. King Calder approached the platform, his massive frame climbing the steps with surprising grace. He extended his hand toward her, and Mara stared at it, confusion warring with survival instinct. This man, this stranger who claimed to be her husband, was offering her life instead of death. Whatever his reasons, whatever truth or lies lay behind that marriage contract, he was her only choice. She placed her small hand in his large one, feeling the warmth of his skin even through the winter's chill. He helped her down the steps, his grip firm but not crushing, supporting her when her legs threatened to buckle from relief and lingering fear. The crowd parted before them, their whispers following like slithering snakes through the snow. King Calder's wife? The half-breed? How long has he hidden this? What game is he playing? King led her through the parting crowd toward a waiting wagon, his buffalo coat shielding her somewhat from the cutting wind and staring eyes. Each step took them further from the gallows, further from death, and into an uncertainty that made Mara's heart race. The wagon stood ready, a team of strong horses stamping impatiently in the gathering snow. Without a word, King lifted her onto the seat as easily as if she were a child, then climbed up beside her. He gathered the reins in his hands, and Mara felt the wagon lurch forward, leaving the town square and its gallows behind. She sat rigid beside him, acutely aware of his massive presence, of the warmth radiating from his body in the cold air. Questions burned in her throat, but she held them back, knowing this wasn't the time or place. The townspeople still watched, their faces visible in windows and doorways as the wagon rolled past. King kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable as he guided the horses through the snowy streets. Only when they had left the last building behind did he speak, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're safe now." 3 simple words, yet they carried a weight that made Mara's eyes sting with unshed tears. Safe, but at what price? And for how long? She didn't know this man, couldn't remember any marriage, and had no idea what he wanted from her. But she was alive, and for now, that would have to be enough. The wagon jolted along the snowy trail, leaving the town and its grim gallows far behind. Each crunch of wheels through fresh powder took them further from death's shadow, though Mara couldn't quite believe she was truly free. She sat rigid on the wagon seat, grateful for the thick wool blanket King had wordlessly dropped around her shoulders, but still shivering, more from shock than cold. The snow fell steadily around them, turning the world into a white blur. The only sounds were the creaking of the wagon, the steady breathing of the bay horses, and the occasional snap of King's reins. He handled the team with confident ease, his massive hands gentle on the leather despite their obvious strength. After what felt like hours of silence, his deep voice finally broke through the stillness. "You saved my life once," he said, eyes still fixed on the trail ahead. 3 years ago, during a Comanche raid near Thompson's trading post. Mara's breath caught as the memory surfaced. A chaotic night of screams and fire, a wounded stranger she'd helped hide in a narrow canyon. "I remember," she said softly. "You were bleeding badly." King nodded. "You stitched me up and kept me hidden until the raiders passed. Then you helped me reach the trading post." His jaw tightened slightly. "There was a traveling preacher there. We exchanged vows before him. You probably thought it was just formality, a way to ensure you'd be compensated if I didn't survive." "I dot." Mara frowned, trying to piece together that fevered night. She remembered the preacher, remembered speaking words he prompted, but everything had been overshadowed by the urgency of keeping her patient alive. "I didn't realize it was binding." "It was." His tone left no room for argument. "And today, it saved your life." The wagon fell silent again as Mara absorbed this. She studied his profile, trying to reconcile this imposing man with the half-dead stranger she'd tended. Why had he waited until now to claim her? What did he expect from this marriage of convenience turned suddenly real? They rode for hours more, the snow deepening until it reached the horses' knees. Just when Mara thought they must be lost in the white wilderness, lights appeared through the falling snow, warm squares of illumination that gradually resolved into windows. As they drew closer, she made out the shape of a sprawling log house nestled against the mountains, smoke curling from multiple chimneys. Calder Ranch, King announced, guiding the team toward a large barn. Your new home. The word home stuck in Mara's throat as she took in the size of the place. This was no simple rancher's cabin. This was the seat of power for one of the territory's largest cattle operations. What place could a half Apache Omega possibly have here? King helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and impersonal at her waist. He led her through the snow to the house's main door, which opened before they reached it. A woman stood in the doorway, gray-haired and straight-backed, her expression carefully neutral as she took in Mara's bedraggled appearance. "Mrs. Avery," King said, "this is my wife, Mara. She'll be joining us from now on." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but she gave a short nod. "Come in then, both of you. You're letting in the cold." Inside, the house was warm and surprisingly welcoming, with polished wood floors and simple but well-made furniture. Mrs. Avery led Mara directly to the large stone fireplace, in what appeared to be the main room. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a chair close to the flames. "You're half frozen." Mara sank into the chair, grateful for the fire's heat. She watched through lowered lashes as Mrs. Avery and King exchanged quiet words, the housekeeper's face showing clear skepticism. Whatever King said in response made her press her lips together tightly, but she nodded and disappeared toward what Mara assumed was the kitchen. She returned shortly with 3 bowls of venison stew, rich with vegetables and fragrant herbs. They ate in awkward silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the crack of burning logs. The stew was delicious, but Mara could barely taste it through her nervousness. Finally, King set down his empty bowl. "You'll have your own room," he said. "Mrs. Avery will show you up. Whatever you need, clothes, personal items, just ask her." Mara nodded, relief warring with confusion at this arrangement. "Thank you," she managed. Mrs. Avery led her up a wide staircase to a comfortable bedroom with a view of the range. The room was simply furnished but clean and warm, with a proper bed and even a small sitting area near the window. The housekeeper provided a nightgown and basic necessities, then left her alone with a brisk sleep well. Mara stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the vast dark range barely visible through the falling snow. The mountains loomed like giants against the night sky, remote and unknowable, much like the man who had saved her life only to bring her to this strange new existence. Had she simply traded one form of confinement for another? The noose might be gone from her neck, but she felt no less trapped. Below in the main room, King sat in his chair by the fire, his jaw tight as he stared into the flames. The wind howled against the shutters, a wild sound that seemed to echo the turmoil in both their hearts. Neither of them slept easily that night, each wondering what the morning would bring to this forced alliance of convenience and survival. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered ranch in soft pink light. Mara woke to the rich aroma of coffee drifting up through the floorboards. She dressed quickly in the clothes Mrs. Avery had left, a simple brown skirt and white blouse that fit well enough, though the fabric felt strange after her old worn clothing. The kitchen was warm and bright, centered around a large wood-burning stove where Mrs. Avery worked with practiced efficiency. She nodded toward the long wooden table without pausing in her cooking. "Sit, coffee's hot." 2 ranch hands already occupied one end of the table. They looked up as Mara entered, their expressions shifting from casual morning weariness to sharp suspicion. The older one, weather-beaten and lean, studied her with narrowed eyes. "That's Jed Carter, our foreman," Mrs. Avery said, setting a cup of coffee in front of Mara. "And Milo beside him. Boys, this is Mrs. Calder." The name felt strange in Mara's ears. Jed's jaw tightened at the title, though he managed a curt nod. "Ma'am," Milo, younger and clearly taking his cues from Jed, simply stared into his coffee. King entered then, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders. He took his place at the head of the table while Mrs. Avery served plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. The meal passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the scrape of utensils and Jed's occasional murmured comments to Milo about the day's work ahead. After breakfast, King gestured for Mara to follow him outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their boots crunching through fresh snow as they walked toward the barn. You'll need to learn the winter routines, he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold. Every hand pulls their weight here. The barn was massive, built from thick timber and river rock. Inside, the sweet smell of hay mingled with leather and horses. King showed her the daily tasks, checking feed levels, ensuring water troughs stayed ice-free, examining horses for any signs of trouble. Ice forms quick in the troughs, he explained, demonstrating how to break it with a special tool. Has to be done morning and night, no exceptions. They moved on to the corrals, where King pointed out weak spots in the fencing that needed attention. Snow and ice are hard on wood, he said, running his hand along a weathered rail. We mend as we go, or spring brings twice the work. As they worked, Mara noticed movement at the corners of her vision. The ranch hands kept appearing at odd moments, checking equipment, leading horses, always at a distance but always watching. Their whispered conversations stopped whenever she came near, replaced by pointed silence. The morning passed in a blur of new tasks and unspoken tension. As afternoon approached, Mara headed to the tack room to return some tools. She slowed at the sound of voices around the corner. If she inherits the ranch, we're done for. It was Jed's voice, low and angry. You know how these legal marriages work. King dies, she gets everything. But she's Apache, Milo protested. Half, anyway. Can she even inherit? That's the real trick of it. King's smart, like he knew what he was doing, claiming her like that. But mark my words, there's trouble coming. Mara backed away silently, her heart pounding. She slipped around the barn's far side before they could spot her, nearly running into King as he emerged from the stable. Everything all right? He asked, noting her expression. She nodded quickly, not meeting his eyes. Just learning my way around. Evening brought fresh snow and a telegram writer despite the weather. King read the message at his desk, his face growing still in a way that made Mara's chest tighten. When he finally looked up, his eyes were troubled. The railroads filed a claim, he said quietly. Water rights for the entire spread. They're saying the title traces back to land that once belonged to your father. Mara's throat went dry. My father's land? But that was seized years ago, after he died. Apparently not all of it. King set the telegram down carefully. The railroad's lawyers have been busy. They're claiming the water rights were never properly transferred. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Without water rights, the ranch would struggle to survive, especially through the territory's brutal summers. Every head of cattle, every crop, every person depended on reliable water access. Snow fell steadily outside the window as they sat down to supper. The usual kitchen sounds, Mrs. Avery's cooking, the clink of plates, the murmur of ranch hands at their own table, seemed muffled, distant. King ate mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. Mara barely touched her food, watching snowflakes swirl against the darkening glass. Later, in her room, sleep proved impossible. Mara sat by the window, studying the white-shrouded landscape, the railroad's claim, the ranch hand's resentment, King's careful distance. It all twisted together like strands of a rope, pulling tighter with each passing hour. Her father's land had brought nothing but pain when he was alive. Now, years after his death, it threatened to cause even more trouble. The snow continued falling, covering everything in silence, while somewhere in the dark, decisions were being made that would affect all their lives. The next morning brought howling winds that rattled the windows of Calder Ranch. Snow whipped sideways across the yard, transforming the landscape into a white blur. The storm had settled in for the day, making outdoor work impossible. King retreated to his study after breakfast, leaving Mara uncertain of her place in this forced confinement. Mrs. Avery solved that dilemma by calling her to the kitchen, where she laid out a pile of clothes needing repair. Might as well make yourself useful, the housekeeper said, handing Mara a needle and thread. These men are hard on their clothes. They worked in silence at first, the only sounds being the crack of wind outside and the soft scrape of thread through fabric. Mara picked up a heavy coat with a torn sleeve, studying the frayed edges carefully before beginning her work. Mrs. Avery glanced over, then did a double take as she watched Mara's fingers move in an intricate pattern. What kind of stitch is that? My mother taught me, Mara explained, demonstrating the technique. It's stronger than a regular seam, especially for heavy materials. See how it creates a double reinforcement? The housekeeper leaned closer, genuine interest replacing her usual reserve. I've never seen anything quite like it. Your mother must have been quite skilled. She was. Mara smiled softly at the memory. She could mend anything, even made her own patterns sometimes. As they worked, Mrs. Avery's stiff manner gradually thawed. She shared stories about particularly challenging repairs she'd tackled over the years, and Mara found herself responding with tales of her mother's creative solutions to mending problems. The morning passed more pleasantly than she'd expected. When supper time arrived, the storm still raged outside. King emerged from his study looking tired, the weight of his concerns visible in the set of his shoulders. Mrs. Avery served a hearty stew, perfect for the bitter weather, but the meal began in tense silence. Finally, King spoke. Without those water rights, we're facing real trouble. He stirred his stew absently. Come summer, the railroad could cut off our access completely. No water means no cattle, no crops, nothing. Mara set down her spoon, her mind racing back through childhood memories. My father, she began hesitantly, then continued more firmly when King looked up. My father was careful with important papers. He always kept them in his Bible, said no one would think to look there. Do you still have it? King asked, sudden interest sharpening his features. It's in my trunk at my aunt's place on the reservation edge. Mara traced a pattern on the tablecloth with her finger. I haven't opened it in years, but I remember seeing him put papers inside. When the storm breaks, we'll ride out there. King's voice held new energy. Any documentation about the water rights could make all the difference. Mrs. Avery cleared the dishes, and King surprised Mara by pulling out a cribbage board. Know how to play? He asked, shuffling a deck of cards. My father taught me, Mara answered, watching him deal. In the lamplight, she noticed details she'd missed before, the tiny creases at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands, though large, moved with surprising grace. This was more than just the imposing figure who'd saved her from the gallows. Here was a man carrying the fate of his land and people on his shoulders, yet still finding time for a simple game. They played several hands, the familiar rhythm of the game easing the day's tensions. King proved to be a skilled player, but Mara held her own, even winning twice. His rare smile of appreciation when she made a particularly clever play warmed her more than she cared to admit. Outside, the storm's fury gradually subsided. The wind died down to occasional gusts, and the heavy snowfall thinned to scattered flakes. When Mara went to her window before bed, the clouds had parted enough to reveal a brilliant moon. Its light transformed the new-fallen snow into a field of diamonds, each drift sculpted by the wind into smooth, graceful curves. The beauty of it caught her breath. But more than that, the clearing weather meant tomorrow they could begin their search for her father's Bible, and perhaps find a way to save the ranch that had become her unexpected sanctuary. The pale winter sun had barely crested the mountains when King and Mara hitched the team to the wagon. Their breath formed white clouds in the frigid morning air as they worked. Mrs. Avery had packed them thick wool blankets and provisions for the journey, knowing the deep snow would slow their progress. Mara settled onto the wagon seat beside King, wrapped in his spare buffalo coat. The heavy garment swallowed her small frame, but its warmth was welcome against the biting cold. King clicked his tongue, and the horses moved forward, their hooves breaking through the crusty snow. The going was slow and difficult. Drifts reached halfway up the wagon bed in places, forcing them to pick their way carefully along the trail. King handled the reins with quiet confidence, guiding the team around the deepest spots. They traveled in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might find in her father's Bible. Around midday, they heard the sound of approaching horses. A group of railroad men appeared through the swirling snow, their dark coats stark against the white landscape. King straightened on the seat, his shoulders tensing slightly. The men tipped their hats with exaggerated politeness as they passed, but their eyes were cold and calculating. Mason's crew, King muttered after they'd gone. Railroads hired guns more like. Mara watched the riders disappear into the whiteness. They were watching us pretty closely. They know what's at stake with those water rights. King's jaw tightened. Best we stay alert. The afternoon sun was low when they finally spotted Aunt Nia's cabin, smoke curling from its chimney into the clear winter sky. The small structure sat at the edge of the reservation lands, a patch of garden covered in snow beside it. As they pulled up, the door opened, and Nia stepped out onto her porch. Despite her advanced years, Nia stood straight and proud. Her dark eyes were sharp as she watched them approach, her silver hair bound in traditional Apache style. When she recognized Mara, her weathered face broke into a warm smile. "Little bird," she called out in Apache, using Mara's childhood name, "you have been away too long." Mara rushed to embrace her aunt, the familiar scent of pine smoke and herbs bringing back memories of safer days. Naya held her close before turning to study King with keen interest. "So this is the man who saved you from the hangman's noose," she said in English, switching languages easily. "Come inside, both of you. The wind bites hard today." The cabin's interior was warm and familiar, dried herbs hanging from the rafters and colorful blankets adorning the walls. As they settled around Nia's table with cups of strong coffee, she shared news that made both her guests exchange worried glances. "There is trouble brewing," Nia said, her voice low. "The reservation agent argues with settlers about grazing rights. Some hot-headed young men talk of taking matters into their own hands. And now the railroad men ride our borders, making everyone nervous." "We might have a way to help," Mara said, explaining about the Bible and the papers they hoped to find. Nia nodded toward the corner where Mara's old trunk sat. "Your things are as you left them, little bird." Mara knelt before the trunk, lifting the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and memories wafted up as she carefully removed familiar items: her mother's shawl, some old dresses, beadwork she'd done as a girl. At the bottom, wrapped in soft deerskin, she found what they sought: her father's Bible, its leather cover worn smooth with age. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Between the pages, yellowed papers crackled. King and Nia moved closer as she carefully unfolded them on the table. The territorial seals were clear, the ink faded but legible. Most importantly, her father's bold signature marked the bottom of what appeared to be a treaty document. Nia studied the papers intently, her expression growing serious. "These prove the land, and the water rights that go with it, belong to our people," she said. "Your father was wise to preserve them." King read through the documents, his expression thoughtful. "This could change everything. The railroad can't claim rights that legally belong to the tribe." The sun was setting by the time they finished discussing the implications of their discovery. Naya insisted on feeding them a hot meal of venison stew and fry bread before they started their journey home. The food was delicious, but Mara noticed her aunt watching her with knowing eyes as she interacted with King. They set out as the last light faded, knowing they couldn't make it all the way back to the ranch before dark. King had a campsite in mind, a sheltered grove he knew well. The precious Bible and its contents were safely stowed in an oilskin wrap, protected from the weather. When they reached the grove, King efficiently set up canvas against the wind, while Mara gathered firewood from the dry interior of fallen logs. Soon they had a small fire going, its light creating a warm circle in the darkness. The horses stamped quietly nearby, the canvas shelter keeping the worst of the wind off all of them. They sat close to the fire, sharing coffee from King's battered tin pot. The treaty papers represented hope, not just for the ranch, but for Mara's people as well. Something had shifted between them during this journey, a tentative trust building as they worked toward this common goal. Above them, stars pierced the clear winter sky, their light reflecting off the snow. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called into the night. The return journey to Calder Ranch took most of the next day, with King and Mara arriving as the sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold. After seeing to the horses, they headed straight to King's study, where Mara carefully removed the papers from their oilskin wrapping. King settled behind his massive oak desk, adjusting the lamp to better examine the documents. His expression remained neutral as he studied each page. But Mara noticed how his fingers traced her father's signature with careful attention. The only sound in the room was the quiet tick of the grandfather clock and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Finally, King opened the desk's bottom drawer, removing a small iron key from his vest pocket. The drawer revealed a heavy strongbox, which he unlocked with practiced movements. He placed the papers inside, along with her father's Bible. "They'll be safe here," he said, securing both locks, "until we can present them to the proper authorities." Mara nodded, understanding the need for caution. The sound of boots on the porch and men's voices signaled the ranch hands returning from their day's work. "I should help Mrs. Avery with supper," she said, moving toward the door. King's quiet "thank you" followed her into the hallway. In the kitchen, Mrs. Avery was already pulling ingredients for beef stew. Without a word, Mara tied on an apron and began peeling potatoes. The older woman shot her an approving glance as they worked side by side, chopping vegetables and cutting beef into chunks. The kitchen filled with warmth and savory aromas as the stew simmered. Mara kneaded dough for biscuits, her movements sure and practiced. When the ranch hands filed in for the evening meal, the table groaned under bowls of steaming stew, golden biscuits, and fresh butter. The men ate in their usual silence, but young Caleb lingered after the others had gone. He pulled something from his pocket, a work glove with a torn seam. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I noticed how neat your stitching was on those coat sleeves. Would you mind?" He held out the glove, cheeks reddening slightly. Mara took it with a gentle smile. "I'll have it fixed by morning." "Thank you kindly," Caleb mumbled, ducking his head before hurrying out. Over the next week, Mara fell into the rhythm of ranch life. Each morning found her breaking ice in the water troughs, the frozen surface shattering under her pry bar. She learned the names of each horse in the stable, cleaning their harnesses until the leather gleamed. The work was hard, but satisfying. She noticed the subtle shifts in the ranch hands' attitudes. A nod here, a muttered thanks there. Even Jed, the most suspicious of the lot, grudgingly accepted her help when she spotted a loose shoe on his favorite mount. King observed these changes from his customary place on the porch, where he often stood in the evenings watching the sunset behind the mountains. One particularly clear evening, Mara noticed the ghost of a smile cross his face as he watched her demonstrate proper bridle cleaning to young Caleb. That night, after the others had retired, Mara stayed behind in the sitting room, enjoying the warmth of the fire. King entered quietly, settling into the chair across from her. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as silence stretched between them. "I was married once," he said suddenly, his voice rough with memory. "Her name was Sarah. We had a son, William." He stared into the fire, hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Fever took them both 8 years ago come spring." Mara's heart ached at the pain in his voice. She remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I withdrew after that, buried myself in ranch work, avoided town, people, everything that reminded me of them." He drew a deep breath. "The ranch hands, they're good men, but they worried, said I'd turn to stone." "Loss changes us," Mara said softly, thinking of her own parents. "Sometimes being stone is the only way to keep standing." King's eyes met hers across the firelight, recognition flickering in their depths. They sat together as the fire burned low, sharing the comfortable silence of those who understand grief's weight. The clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the quiet house. Neither moved immediately, finding solace in the simple presence of another soul who understood the language of loss. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer to the white blanket covering the sleeping ranch. The morning dawned unusually bright, sunlight glinting off the snow-covered peaks. After weeks of gray skies and storms, the clear weather felt like a gift. Through the kitchen window, Mara watched King and his men preparing for the cattle drive to the lower pasture. The winter lean herd needed better grazing, and the sunny day provided their chance. Without hesitation, Mara pulled on her warmest clothes and headed to the barn. King looked up from adjusting his saddle as she entered. "I'm coming with you," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. You'll need every hand you can get." King studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Take the bay mare. She's steady in deep snow." The ranch hands exchanged glances as Mara mounted up, but said nothing. She settled into the saddle with practiced ease, gathering the reins in gloved hands. Her mother had taught her to ride before she could walk, and years on the reservation had only sharpened those skills. They set out with the sun still low, the cattle moving slowly through the crusty snow. Mara rode alongside King, their horses matching stride. The herd stretched out before them like a dark river winding through white banks. Behind them, Jed and the other hands kept the stragglers moving. Near midday, they reached the creek that marked the halfway point. The water ran swift and dark between banks of ice, narrow enough for the cattle to cross safely, or so they thought. As the first few animals picked their way across, a young calf strayed too close to a thin patch. The ice cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The calf's terrified bawl cut through the crisp air as it plunged into the freezing water. Its mother paced the bank, calling frantically. Without thinking twice, Mara swung down from her horse. "Mara, wait!" King started, but she was already moving. The icy water hit her like a physical blow as she waded in, her boots finding purchase on the slippery creek bed. The calf thrashed weakly, its strength fading fast. Mara pushed through the chest-deep water, ignoring the numbing cold that seemed to steal her breath. "Get ready!" she called to the bank, where King and Jed had already dismounted and were positioning themselves to help. Reaching the struggling calf, Mara braced herself against the current. With trembling arms, she pushed upward, lifting the animal's hindquarters toward the bank. King and Jed leaned out, catching hold of the calf's legs. Together, they heaved it onto solid ground, where it stumbled to its feet and ran bleeding to its mother. Mara's teeth chattered as she made her way back to shore. Her soaked clothes felt like sheets of ice against her skin. Strong hands gripped her arms, helping her up the bank. Before she could protest, King was shrugging out of his heavy buffalo coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, but his eyes held something that looked like admiration. Jed handed her a flask of whiskey. "Best take a sip, ma'am. Ward off the chill." The liquor burned going down, but it helped. They got her back on her horse, and King stayed close as they continued the drive. By the time they reached the lower pasture, feeling had returned to her extremities, though her clothes were stiff with ice. The crew made camp as the sun began to set, building a roaring fire. Mara sat close to the flames, still wrapped in King's coat, while the men tended to the horses and settled the herd. She could hear them talking quietly among themselves as they worked. "Did you see how she just went in after that calf?" Young Caleb's voice carried on the evening air. "Never hesitated," another hand agreed. "The boss's wife has sand, that's certain." "Reckon we were wrong about her," came Jed's gruff response. "Takes more than breeding to make a person worth their salt." The sky darkened to deep blue, stars appearing one by one. Most of the men had turned in, leaving Mara and King alone by the fire. The flames painted his features in warm light and shadow as he studied her across the dying embers. "Thank you," he said finally, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "What you did today. It reminded me of something." Mara looked up, questioning. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the women who helped settle this territory," he continued, "how they worked alongside their men, facing every hardship with grit and grace, never backing down when things got hard." His eyes met hers. "You're cut from that same cloth." Heat crept into Mara's cheeks, and not from the fire. She dropped her gaze, unsure how to respond to the quiet intensity in his voice. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken things. A wolf howled in the distance, breaking the spell. Mara pulled King's coat tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the leather and tobacco scent that clung to it. Beyond their circle of firelight, the creek's steady song filled the night air, its waters running clear and strong under the pale moon. The days grew shorter as December settled over Calder Ranch, bringing with it the crisp anticipation of Christmas. The kitchen filled with the warm, sweet scents of Mrs. Avery's baking, cinnamon and nutmeg wafting through the house as she prepared her famous apple and pumpkin pies. The old wood stove radiated heat while she worked, humming carols under her breath. At the kitchen table, Mara sat surrounded by scraps of fabric and thread, her nimble fingers crafting small gifts for the ranch hands. For young Caleb, she fashioned a warm neck scarf from soft wool. Jed would receive new leather gloves, carefully stitched with deer hide she'd traded from her aunt. Each gift was chosen with thought and care, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "You've got quite the touch with that needle," Mrs. Avery commented, sliding another pie into the oven. Her initial coolness toward Mara had thawed over the weeks, like spring ice breaking up on the creek. "My mother taught me," Mara replied softly, threading another needle. "She said every stitch should carry good wishes." The kitchen door opened, letting in a blast of cold air as King stamped snow from his boots. He'd ridden to town for supplies, his horse loaded with provisions for the holiday feast. But there was something else. A wrapped bundle tucked carefully under his arm. "Mara," he called, his deep voice gentle. "I brought you something." She looked up surprised as he placed the package before her. The brown paper fell away to reveal lengths of fine calico in a deep winter blue, the color of twilight on snow. Mara's fingers trembled as she touched the fabric. "For Christmas Eve," King explained, watching her face. "I thought you might like a new dress for the dance." Mara's heart quickened. The annual Christmas Eve gathering was a tradition at Calder Ranch, neighbors riding in from miles around to fill the barn with music and laughter. She hadn't dared hope to participate, but here was King, offering her a place in that celebration. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the fabric close. Mrs. Avery's knowing smile went unnoticed as King nodded and strode from the kitchen. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. The men strung lanterns in the barn, clearing space for dancing. Mara worked late into the nights, sewing her dress by lamplight. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, the ranch hummed with excitement. As dusk approached, wagons and riders began arriving, the barn filled with the sounds of greeting and laughter. A trio of musicians, fiddle, guitar, and harmonica, tuned their instruments in one corner. The lantern light cast a warm glow over everything, making the rough-hewn walls seem almost magical. Mara stood before her mirror upstairs, hardly recognizing herself. The blue calico dress fit perfectly, its full skirt swishing as she turned. She'd woven ribbons into her dark hair and borrowed a pair of Mrs. Avery's pearl earrings. "For luck," the housekeeper had insisted with unusual warmth. When she descended the stairs and stepped into the barn, conversation stuttered to a halt. Dozens of eyes turned her way. Neighbors, ranch hands, even the musicians paused their tuning. In that moment of silence, King moved through the crowd toward her. He wore his best black coat, silver watch chain gleaming at his vest. Without hesitation, he held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Calder?" The musicians struck up a waltz. King led her to the center of the floor, one hand settling at her waist while the other clasped hers. They began to move, and Mara forgot about the watching crowd. The blue calico swirled around her feet as they turned, following the sweet, slow melody. "You look beautiful," King murmured, his eyes never leaving her face. They danced through several songs, other couples joining them on the floor. Mara caught glimpses of Mrs. Avery beaming from the sidelines, and even Jed tipped his hat when they passed. The lantern light made everything glow like a dream. As the last waltz ended, King didn't release her hand. Instead, he turned to face the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. "Most of you know how Mara came to be my wife," he began. "Through an old debt and a marriage contract neither of us truly chose." He paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But now I'm asking, in front of all of you, Mara Loring, will you choose to be my wife? Not because of any paper or obligation, but because it's what we both want?" Mara's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. She saw the truth in his eyes, how far they'd come from that snowy day at the gallows, how much had changed between them. This proud, quiet man was offering her not just his name, but his heart. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I choose you." The barn erupted in cheers and applause. Someone whooped, and the musicians struck up a joyful reel. King pulled her close, and Mara felt his smile against her hair. The celebration continued late into the night. There was dancing and feasting, Mrs. Avery's pies disappearing amid praise and laughter. When it was time to leave, their neighbors loaded into wagons with calls of congratulations and Christmas wishes. The ride back to the house was peaceful, their horses' hooves muffled in the snow. Warmth lingered between them, more precious than any Christmas gift. Above, stars scattered across the winter sky like diamond dust, blessing the night with their cold, clear light. The night after Christmas brought a bitter wind howling down from the mountains, rattling the windows of Calder Ranch. Inside, Mara sat by the fire, working on a new pair of mittens while King went over his ledgers. The peaceful scene shattered when thundering hooves suddenly filled the yard, followed by shouts and the terrible crack of gunfire. King leaped to his feet, grabbing his rifle from above the mantel. "Stay inside," he ordered, but Mara was already reaching for her shawl. The sound of splintering wood and men's voices echoed from the direction of the barn. Through the window they saw shadows moving in the darkness, at least 6 riders, their faces hidden beneath pulled-down hats. One of them hurled a blazing torch through the barn's upper window. Orange flames erupted against the night sky as dry hay caught fire. "The horses!" Mara cried out. She and King raced outside into the bitter cold, joining the ranch hands who were already running toward the inferno. The raiders had scattered, but their purpose became clear when they saw King's prize stallion, Midnight, being led away at gunpoint, fighting the unfamiliar hands on his reins. "Get that fire out!" King shouted to the men, his voice cutting through the chaos. Jed and Caleb formed a bucket line from the well, while Milo and the others worked to free the panicked horses from their stalls. Mara grabbed a blanket, beating at flames that threatened to spread to the main structure. The wind whipped sparks high into the air as they fought the blaze. Smoke stung their eyes and throats. For endless minutes, they worked in desperate silence, broken only by the crackle of flames and the frightened whinnying of horses. Finally, the last ember was doused, leaving them exhausted and covered in soot in the frozen night. "Railroad men," Jed spat, examining distinctive boot prints in the trampled snow, "saw their company brands on their horses." King's jaw clenched as he surveyed the damage. Part of the barn's roof was destroyed, and the loss of his stallion was a deliberate message. But before he could speak, more hooves approached from the road, this time at a steady official pace. Marshal Silas Drummond rode into the yard, flanked by 2 deputies. His face was grim in the moonlight as he dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. "King Calder," he said formally, "I have business here." "Seems everyone does tonight," King replied coldly, moving to stand beside Mara. The marshal pulled a document from his coat. "I have a warrant for Mara Loring's arrest on charges of forgery and fraud against the territorial government." His voice carried across the yard. "The treaty papers she presented are suspected false documents." Mara felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. They were my father's, kept in his Bible all these years." According to railroad company experts, the seals and signatures don't match territorial records. Drummond's expression showed no emotion. "Furthermore, if these charges prove true, your marriage may be annulled on grounds of fraudulent representation." King's hand found Mara's, gripping it tight. "You'll need more than railroad company experts to prove those accusations, Marshal. Those papers were witnessed and sealed by a territorial judge." "That's for the court to decide." Drummond stepped forward. "I'm authorized to take her into custody now." "No." King's voice was like steel. "You know as well as I do that a property owner has the right to a proper hearing before being detained. She's my wife and co-owner of this ranch. We'll ride to the Capitol ourselves and face these charges legally." The marshal studied them both for a long moment. The wind moaned around the corners of the damaged barn, carrying the lingering smell of smoke. Finally, he nodded. "You have 3 days to present yourselves to the territorial court. Don't make me come looking." They watched in tense silence as Drummond and his deputies rode away. The ranch hands gathered closer, their faces showing concern and anger at this latest attack. "Get some rest," King told them. "We'll assess the damage at first light." Inside the house, Mara sank into a chair by the dying fire. "They're trying to destroy everything," she whispered. "The ranch, our marriage, my father's legacy, all of it." King lit the lamp on his desk, its warm glow pushing back the darkness. They won't succeed. He spread out a map of the territory, beginning to plan their journey. "We'll leave at dawn. It's a 4-day ride to the capital if we push hard." Mara moved to stand beside him, studying the route he traced with his finger. What if they're right about the papers? What if something's wrong with them? "Listen to me." King turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I know you. You're no fraud. And whatever happens with those papers or that court, you're my wife. I chose you, remember? Nothing changes that." Tears threatened to spill from Mara's eyes, but she blinked them back. This was no time for weakness. Instead, she straightened her spine and began making her own lists, supplies they'd need, arrangements for the ranch in their absence. They worked through the night by lamplight, their shadows moving across the walls as they prepared for the journey ahead. Outside, the wind gradually died down, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional crack of frozen branches in the forest. The burned barn stood as a dark reminder of how quickly their world could change, while somewhere in the distance, King's stolen stallion was being led further and further away. Dawn was still hours off when they finally had their plans in order. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they faced them together, their resolve as solid as the mountains watching over the ranch. The pale winter sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when Mara and King prepared to leave Calder Ranch. Mrs. Avery packed them dried beef, hard biscuits, and coffee beans, while Jed helped secure a small wooden sled behind their horses. The sled would carry their tent, extra blankets, and supplies needed for the 4-day journey to the territorial capital. "Stay alert," Jed warned as he adjusted the leather straps. "Railroad men don't fight fair." King nodded, checking his rifle before sliding it into the scabbard on his saddle. He wore his heavy buffalo coat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. Beside him, Mara mounted her paint mare, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. Her father's Bible, containing the disputed treaty papers, was secured inside her coat. They set out as the sun crested the trees, their horses' breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The sled runners creaked across packed snow, leaving twin trails behind them. King led them east, following the winter road that wound through stands of pine and aspen. Few travelers used this route in deep winter, making their tracks the only marks in the pristine snow. Progress was slow. Often they had to dismount and lead the horses through deep drifts, the sled bogging down until they both pushed it free. By midday, they had covered less distance than King had hoped. They stopped in a sheltered grove to rest the horses and share a cold meal of beef and biscuits. "We'll make better time tomorrow," King said, studying the sky. "Snow's packed harder ahead." Mara nodded, but her eyes scanned the tree line. Something felt wrong, a stillness that seemed too complete. King noticed her unease and kept his rifle close when they resumed riding. Her instincts proved right on the second day. Around mid-morning, Mara spotted 2 riders following their trail, keeping to the shadows of the forest about half a mile back. They maintained that distance throughout the day, never closing in, but never falling behind. "Railroad men?" Mara asked quietly when they made camp that evening. "Most likely." King's voice was grim as he gathered firewood. "They'll wait until they have the advantage." They chose their campsite carefully, a small clearing backed by steep rocks, leaving only one approach. King strung canvas between trees to block the wind and reflect the heat of their small fire. As darkness settled, he methodically cleaned and loaded his rifle while Mara used a whetstone to sharpen her skinning knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. Neither slept much that night. They took turns watching, wrapped in furs against the cold, listening to every snap of frozen branches and whisper of wind. The stalkers made no move, but their presence weighed heavily in the darkness. Dawn brought heavy clouds and the threat of snow. They broke camp quickly, wanting to make good distance before any storm hit. The path ahead led through a narrow pass between towering cliffs, the only route through this section of mountains. "They'll try there," King said, checking his rifle again. "No way around it." Mara gripped her reins tighter, the skinning knife secure in her boot. They approached the pass slowly, eyes searching the rocks above. The wind moaned between the cliff walls, making it hard to hear anything else. The attack came halfway through the pass. The two riders they'd spotted appeared ahead, rifles raised, while more men emerged from behind rocks above. King's rifle cracked, sending one attacker scrambling for cover. Mara drew her knife as a bullet splintered the sled runner beside her. But before the ambushers could press their advantage, war cries echoed off the cliff walls. A group of mounted Apache warriors swept into the pass from a hidden side trail, their horses kicking up snow as they charged. Leading them was a tall man Mara recognized instantly, her cousin Tahoma, his face painted for battle. The railroad men turned their horses and fled, disappearing into the trees with the Apache riders in close pursuit. Only Tahoma remained, guiding his pinto stallion to where Mara and King waited. "Cousin," he greeted her in Apache, then switched to English. "We've been watching the railroad men watching you." Mara smiled, relief and gratitude flooding through her. "Your timing is perfect, Tahoma." He nodded, his dark eyes serious. "The elders heard about the treaty papers. Those documents affect all our people. We'll escort you to the capital." As if on cue, the other Apache riders returned, spreading out to guard both ends of the pass. King studied them, then extended his hand to Tahoma. "We're grateful for the protection." Tahoma clasped his hand firmly. "The railroad men steal from all of us, land, water, horses. This fight is for everyone who calls these mountains home." With the Apache riders flanking them, they continued their journey. The railroad men did not return. Tahoma's warriors knew hidden trails and sheltered camping spots, making their progress easier despite the deepening snow. Each night, they shared their fire and food with their escorts, trading stories and building bonds of trust. Mara found herself translating between King and her Apache kin, watching with quiet joy as mutual respect grew between them. She saw how King listened intently when Tahoma spoke of tribal rights and railroad greed. She noticed how the Apache warriors nodded approvingly at King's skilled horsemanship and fair treatment of his wife. On the eve of their final push to the capital, Tahoma pulled Mara aside while the others prepared the camp. "You chose well," he said in Apache, gesturing toward King. "He has a strong heart." "Yes," Mara replied softly, watching her husband help secure the horses for the night. "He does." The warriors would accompany them all the way to the territorial court, Tahoma explained. Their presence would remind the judges that this case affected more than just one ranch or one marriage. It was about the rights of all people who had lived on this land long before railroad companies drew lines across maps. That night, wrapped in furs beside their fire, Mara felt strength flowing from the mountains themselves. The strength of her Apache heritage combining with the determination she'd learned from King. Whatever challenges awaited them in the capital, they would face them together, supported by the bonds of both their peoples. After 4 grueling days on the trail, Mara and King finally approached the territorial capital. The city's spires rose through a haze of coal smoke, buildings pressed together like a flock of winter-dark birds. Streets that had once been mud were now frozen into treacherous ruts, their wagon wheels clattering over the uneven surface. Tahoma and his warriors held back at the city limits. "We'll make camp in those trees," he told Mara, pointing to a sheltered grove just outside town. "Close enough if you need us." His expression remained stoic, but his eyes held concern for his cousin heading into the white man's domain of law and politics. King guided their tired horses through the crowded streets. The afternoon air bit sharp and cold, heavy with the acrid smell of coal fires. People hurried past wrapped in wool coats and scarves, barely glancing at the trail-worn couple. A few did double takes at Mara's distinctive Apache features, but she held her head high, remembering Tahoma's words about standing proud for all their people. They found lodging at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson. The establishment sat 3 blocks from the courthouse, its red brick facade weathered but well-maintained. Inside, worn carpets muffled their footsteps, and a coal stove in the sitting room provided welcome warmth after so many nights sleeping rough. "Just married?" Mrs. Peterson asked as she showed them to their room, noting their travel-stained clothes and the way King hovered protectively near Mara. Yes, King answered simply, though Mara noticed he didn't specify how recently. Their room was small but clean, with a brass bed and a desk beneath the window. Mrs. Peterson brought up hot water for washing and promised dinner would be ready in an hour. Once alone, Mara sank onto the bed, exhaustion catching up with her. But King was already pulling on his coat again. We should go to the courthouse now, while there's still daylight. Get a sense of what we're facing. The courthouse dominated the town square, its stone steps slick with ice. Inside, their boots echoed on marble floors as they sought the clerk's office. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. Calder versus Western Railroad? He shuffled through a stack of papers. Hearings set for day after tomorrow, 9 o'clock sharp. He glanced between them, his gaze lingering on Mara. You should know the railroads brought in Augustus Hammond to argue their case. King's jaw tightened. Even Mara had heard of Hammond, a lawyer famous for helping railroad companies secure land rights across the territory. The clerk's warning hung heavy in the air as they left the courthouse. Hammond's won cases against bigger ranches than ours, King said quietly as they walked back through the deepening dusk. But he's never faced anyone like you. Mara squeezed his hand, grateful for his confidence. After a simple dinner of beef stew and fresh bread in the boarding house dining room, they retired to their room. While other guests gathered in the parlor for evening socializing, Mara sat at the small desk, drafting her testimony by lamplight. She wrote carefully, remembering every detail about her father's trading post, his careful documentation of land agreements, his respect for both Apache and settler ways. She described how he had taught her to read English and Apache both, to understand the importance of treaties and promises. Her pen scratched across the paper as she recalled finding the documents in his Bible, explaining their significance. Across the room, King sat in the room's single armchair, writing letters to his foreman about managing the ranch in their absence. The scratch of their pens and the occasional pop from the coal stove were the only sounds. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, adding another layer of white to the city's streets. Hours passed. Mara's hand cramped, but she kept writing, determined to leave nothing out that might help their case. She felt the weight of more than just their ranch riding on this hearing. The rights of her Apache relatives, the future of the land itself seemed to hang in the balance. Finally, as the lamp oil burned low, King set aside his letters and came to stand behind her chair. His strong hands rested on her shoulders, gentle despite their calluses from ranch work. Mara leaned back, allowing herself to draw strength from his solid presence. You should rest, he said softly. You've done all you can tonight. What if it's not enough? The question that had been haunting her slipped out before she could stop it. King turned her chair so she faced him, then took both her hands in his. His blue eyes, usually sharp as winter sky, had softened. Mara, he said, whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know, I'm proud of you. Proud of your strength, your dignity, the way you've faced every challenge. He squeezed her hands. Whatever the verdict, that won't change. Mara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This man who had saved her from the gallows, who had opened his home and eventually his heart to her, now offered something even more precious. Unconditional acceptance? She stood, still holding his hands. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. They readied themselves for bed in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of the coming days. As Mara lay beside King in the narrow brass bed, listening to his breathing even out in sleep, she touched the place where her father's Bible rested in the drawer beside them. Tomorrow they would prepare further, but for now, she allowed herself to rest, drawing comfort from King's warmth and the knowledge that, win or lose, lose, she no longer faced life's battles alone. The territorial courthouse stood silent as marble on the morning of the hearing, its wooden benches already filled with curious onlookers. Frost patterns decorated the tall windows, casting latticed shadows across the floor. Mara sat beside King in the front row, her back straight, despite the weight of so many stairs. Railroad lawyer Augustus Hammond cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit, arranging papers on the prosecution table with precise movements. When Judge Franklin Porter entered, his black robe sweeping behind him, the room rose in unison. Case number 423, the clerk announced. Western Railroad Company versus Mara Loring Calder regarding water rights and land claims in Cedar Valley. Hammond rose first, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. Your Honor, this case is quite simple. We have here an opportunist who has fabricated claims to valuable water rights through questionable documents and a suspicious marriage of convenience. He paced before the bench, each step measured. Miss Loring, and I use that name deliberately, appeared conveniently, just as the railroad's development plans were announced. She produces mysterious papers and claims a years-old marriage to one of the territory's wealthiest ranchers. The timing is, shall we say, remarkable. Mara felt King's hand tighten on the rail before them. When her turn came, she walked to the front with steady steps, laying out her father's Bible and the treaty papers. Her voice remained clear and strong as she explained their providence. These papers bear not only my father's signature, but the territorial seal, she stated, pointing to the worn documents. They establish clear ownership of the land and its water rights, predating any railroad claims by 15 years. Judge Porter examined the papers carefully. And the matter of this marriage? It seems rather convenient, Mrs. Calder, if that is indeed your name. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was the moment Mara had been waiting for. She withdrew an envelope from her skirt pocket, still slightly warm from its journey. I have here a sworn statement from Reverend Thomas Miller, who performed our marriage ceremony 6 years ago during the Comanche raids. She handed the document to the bailiff. It was delivered this morning by my cousin after riding through the night to the Reverend's current home in Kansas Territory. The judge's eyebrows rose as he read the detailed statement, complete with dates and witnesses. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. Hammond's face darkened as he demanded to examine the document. King took the stand next, his powerful frame making the witness box seem small. In his deep, steady voice, he recounted the events of the Comanche raid, how Mara had found him wounded, had helped him reach safety, and how they had exchanged vows before the traveling preacher as thanks for God's mercy in their survival. I didn't expect to see her again, King admitted. But when I heard they were going to hang her for supposedly stealing my own horses I had already reported found, I knew I had to honor that vow. What started as duty has become something else entirely. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to several spectators' eyes. Judge Porter called for a recess before making his final ruling. As they filed out of the courtroom, Mara and King found the courthouse steps crowded with townspeople, some offering support, while others muttered darkly about Indian claims and railroad progress. Tahoma waited at the edge of the crowd, still dusty from his long ride to fetch the preacher's statement. He nodded once to Mara, his mission accomplished. The future hung balanced like a snowflake, waiting to fall. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows. When Judge Porter returned to the bench, the room fell silent as he settled into his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles while reviewing the documents before him one final time. Mara's heart thundered in her chest as she waited, King's solid presence beside her offering silent support. Judge Porter cleared his throat. Having reviewed all evidence presented, including the territorial treaty papers, witness statements, and the sworn affidavit from Reverend Miller, I am prepared to deliver my ruling. He paused, his stern gaze sweeping the packed courtroom. This case hinges on 2 key matters, the validity of both a marriage and a land claim. Let us address them in turn. The railroad lawyer, Hammond, leaned forward, his fingers drumming quietly on the table. Mara forced herself to breathe steadily, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Regarding the marriage between Mara Loring and King Calder, the judge continued, Reverend Miller's detailed statement coupled with Mr. Calder's testimony leaves no room for doubt. The marriage was legally performed and witnessed 6 years ago. Any suggestion of recent fabrication is hereby dismissed. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Porter raised his hand for silence before continuing. As to the matter of the water rights and land claims, the treaty papers presented by Mrs. Calder bear not only authentic territorial seals, but also predate the railroad's claim by 15 years. The documents establish clear ownership rights belonging to her father's people, rights which pass legally to his heir. He fixed Hammond with a stern look. The railroad's attempt to supersede these existing claims is both legally unsound and, I must say, morally questionable. Hammond shot to his feet. Your Honor, the economic impact is not relevant to the letter of the law. Judge Porter cut him off firmly. My ruling is as follows. The treaty is valid and binding. The marriage between Mara Loring Calder and King Calder stands uncontested. The water rights of Cedar Valley belong to Mrs. Calder and her people to be managed as they see fit. He brought down his gavel with finality. This case is dismissed. The courtroom erupted in a chaos of voices. Mara sat stunned for a moment until she felt King's warm hand close over hers. She turned to find him smiling, a rare sight that transformed his usually stern features. It's done, he said softly, helping her to her feet. They made their way through the crowd, accepting congratulations from some and ignoring dark looks from others. Outside, the winter sun blazed bright against fresh snow, making Mara blink as they descended the courthouse steps. The air felt cleaner somehow, as if a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. Tahoma waited with their horses, his face breaking into a broad smile at their expressions. Good news travels in your faces, he said, clasping King's hand before hugging his cousin. I will ride ahead to tell your ranch crew. They should know their home is secure. Thank you, Mara said warmly. For everything. The dawn ride to fetch the preacher's statement had been crucial to their victory. Tahoma mounted his horse with fluid grace. We are family, he said simply, then turned his mount toward the ranch road, kicking up sparks of snow as he galloped away. That evening, Mara and King hosted Tahoma's riders for supper at the boarding house. The owner's wife outdid herself, producing platters of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. The small dining room rang with conversation and laughter, the Apache riders mixing easily with King as they shared tales of their territories. Mara watched it all with a quiet joy, seeing the future unfold before her, not just the ranch's security, but a bridging of two worlds. King caught her eye across the table and raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. She smiled back, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. As the evening wound down, talk turned to tomorrow's journey. We'll start at first light, King announced. The weather looks fair, but winter can turn quick in the high country. The riders nodded in agreement, understanding the wisdom of an early start. One by one, they bid goodnight, heading out to their camp beyond the town limits. Soon, only Mara and King remained at the table, sharing a last cup of coffee in comfortable silence. Through the boarding house window, Mara could see stars emerging in the crystal-clear sky. Tomorrow they would ride home, not just to the ranch, but to a future she could finally claim as her own, one through justice rather than chance. The journey home stretched across 7 days of brightening skies and softening snow. Though the drifts no longer threatened their progress as severely as during their outbound ride, King and Mara took their time, letting the horses rest often and enjoying the lengthening daylight hours. Each evening, they made camp beneath stars that seemed to shine with renewed clarity, as if celebrating their victory. On the morning of their final day's ride, Mara spotted the familiar silhouette of Calder Ranch against the mountain backdrop. Smoke curled invitingly from the main house chimney, and even from a distance, she could see movement in the yard as the crew went about their morning chores. Look there, King said, pointing to the growing cluster of figures near the barn. Word of their approach had clearly spread, and the entire crew was gathering to welcome them home. As they guided their horses into the yard, cheers erupted from the waiting crowd. Jed waved his hat in the air, while Mrs. Avery stood beaming on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Young Caleb pushed through the group, reaching for their horses' reins with an eager grin. Welcome home, boss, Mrs. Calder, he called out, his previous wariness completely forgotten. I'll see to the horses. King dismounted first, turning to help Mara down from her saddle. Her boots had barely touched the ground when Mrs. Avery hurried forward to embrace her, surprising everyone, including herself, with a spontaneous show of affection. "The house has been too quiet without you both," the housekeeper declared, stepping back with slightly misty eyes. Come in, come in. I've prepared a proper welcome feast." The rich aroma of roasting beef and fresh-baked bread wafted from the house, making Mara's mouth water after days of trail cooking. The crew followed them inside, filling the dining room with the comfortable noise of boots on floorboards and cheerful conversation. Mrs. Avery had outdone herself. The long table groaned under platters of perfectly cooked roast beef, golden loaves of bread still warm from the oven, and vegetables preserved from the fall harvest. At the sideboard sat 3 golden brown apple pies, their sweetness perfuming the air. "To the boss and his lady," Jed proposed, raising his coffee cup, "and to keeping our water rights where they belong." The toast was echoed around the table with enthusiasm. Mara felt warmth spread through her chest as she looked at these faces, no longer suspicious strangers, but family. Even Mrs. Avery served her with a motherly smile, adding an extra slice of pie to her plate with a conspiratorial wink. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered pastures, King and Mara slipped out onto the front porch. The air held the crystal clarity unique to winter evenings, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but beautiful enough to make the discomfort worthwhile. Before them stretched the ranch lands, peaceful under their blanket of white, leading out to where the mountains rose majestically against the darkening sky. King wrapped his arm around Mara's shoulders, drawing her close against the evening chill. For a long moment, they stood in comfortable silence, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the windows behind them. "You saved me twice," King said finally, his deep voice soft with emotion. "Once from death, and once from myself." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the last gleams of sunset. "After losing Sarah and the baby, I thought I was done with living, just existing, running the ranch like a man sleepwalking through his days." Mara leaned into his solid warmth, understanding now why the crew had once described him as a shadow of himself. "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now I'm awake again," he answered simply. "Because of you." Inside, someone struck up a tune on a harmonica. The warm glow of lamplight spilled from the windows, painting golden rectangles on the snow. Mara breathed in the crisp air, taking in the scene before her, the vast spread of their land, the strong man beside her, the sounds of joy and family behind her. This was home, not just a place she was allowed to stay, but somewhere she truly belonged. She had fought for it, bled for it, stood tall for it in that courtroom, and now it was hers, not just by law or marriage, but by the deepest truth of her heart. The mountains glowed white in the distance, eternal guardians of their valley. Behind them, the music and laughter continued, a soundtrack to their new beginning. Mara turned her face up to King's, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt in her soul. She was home, for good. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.